Before we begin this disturbing story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exclusive reports like this one. Here, we investigate the darkest mysteries hidden behind places that seem ordinary at first glance. And tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to know how far these stories are going. The morning mist hung low over the city of San Jose when Clara Bennett stepped through the rusty gates of the infamous Winchester mystery house. The mansion stood like a sleeping creature, asymmetrical towers, windows that led nowhere, and corridors that seemed to fold back on themselves. Clara didn't believe in ghosts. A historian specializing in Victorian architecture, she had been hired by a private group interested in restoring forgotten parts of the mansion. The official objective was technical, to catalogue hidden structures, map alterations made in the early 20th century, and determine which areas could be opened to the public. But there was something more. The lead investor, Richard Hale, never directly mentioned what motivated him. He always visited the site at night. He observed in silence. He asked overly specific questions about old blueprints and accounts from workers who had worked there decades ago. Clara noticed this from day one. The house was a living labyrinth. Stairs ended at the ceiling, doors opened onto solid walls. Small interior windows looked out onto other sealed rooms. Every detail seemed designed to confuse or conceal. Unlike the folkloric versions circulating about Sarah Winchester, Clara saw something more human than supernatural. Obsession, prolonged grief, paranoia perhaps, but not spirits. In his first week on the job, one detail shattered his certainty. In a rarely explored wing, behind a panel that seemed merely decorative, Clara found a raw wooden door. Unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't in any known records. It didn't appear on any official floor plan. She called the technical team. Richard showed up before them. "That area isn't in the contract," he said curtly. Clara crossed her arms. "That's precisely why it needs to be analyzed." His gaze lingered a second longer than necessary. That night, Clara reviewed historical documents at the hotel. Workers' accounts described nighttime instructions, unexplained project changes, and cash payments for services that were never recorded. But what bothered her wasn't the past. It was the gift. The following morning, the panel was closed. The door had been removed, no marks on the ground, no signs of construction. The team swore they hadn't touched anything there. Clara returned home alone after work. She walked through the silent corridors as the sun disappeared behind the leaning towers. The interior creaked as if it were breathing. She found the panel again, but it wasn't where he remembered it. The architecture seemed out of place, or its memory was betraying it. When he finally located the correct wall, the panel was slightly open, and the door, inside, had reappeared. This time, there was something new. Recent scratch marks on the wood, as if someone had tried to get out. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She didn't believe in spirits, but he believed in secrets, and someone was trying to stop her from finding them. On the other side of the property, Richard watched through the newly installed security cameras. He zoomed in on the image of the hidden door. He whispered something that Clara couldn't hear. The mansion was not just a historical monument. It was a safe. And Clara had just found the lock. The Winchester Mystery House wasn't just an eccentric tourist attraction. It was part of the historical identity of San Jose, a city that grew up among orchards and later transformed into the technological heart of Silicon Valley. While modern skyscrapers reflected the Californian sun, the mansion remained a Victorian anomaly. Dark wood, ornate stained glass, and a constant sense of temporal displacement. Clara quickly realized that the setting influenced more than just the aesthetics of the story. The American culture of turning tragedies into tourism had shaped the public narrative of the house. Guides repeated stories about the eccentric heiress, supposedly tormented by the spirits of the family's rifle victims. Visitors sought chills, not facts. But Clara was looking for documents. In the Municipal Historical Archive, he found inconsistent building permit records. For decades, renovations had been vaguely recorded, often with generic descriptions such as internal structural alterations, no mention of sealed chambers. Meanwhile, Richard Hale was beginning to reveal layers of his own story. He wasn't just a real estate investor. He had built a fortune acquiring historic properties at risk of bankruptcy and reselling them after tourist revaluation. However, the mansion was different. He had refused offers from international franchises interested in transforming the place into an interactive horror experience. He maintained strict control over specific areas of the house, especially the less well-known wings. Clara began to suspect that his interest was personal. The tension between the two grew silently. He didn't confront her directly, but it always surfaced when she approached certain areas. He observed. He asked questions that were too technical for someone without an architectural background. The secondary characters also added new layers to the atmosphere. Miguel Torres, the structural engineer responsible for the building's safety, was pragmatic and skeptical. The son of Mexican immigrants, he had grown up hearing stories about haunted houses, but believed only in structural flaws and rotten wood. Even so, he confessed to Clara that recently installed thermal sensors were registering inexplicable variations in sealed areas, changes too abrupt for a simple air current. Hannah Reed, a veteran guide at the mansion, represented the other extreme. She knew every legend, every visitor's account of hearing footsteps or seeing shadows in the upper windows. But, outside of the tours, she was surprisingly reserved. "The stories help pay the bills," she said one afternoon, organizing brochures. "But there are things here that aren't in the script." She discreetly mentioned a former employee who disappeared in the 1980s. Officially, he had resigned. Unofficially, he had supposedly discovered something in an area closed to the public. Clara wrote down the name. As she delved deeper, she realized that the mansion's past reflected the very American spirit of the late 19th century. Sudden wealth, industrial expansion, and constant fear. Fear of bankruptcy, of revenge, of social instability. Legend had it that the never-ending construction was an attempt to appease spirits. Clara began to consider another hypothesis. Perhaps it was an attempt to hide something physical, something concrete. The atmosphere reinforced this suspicion. The narrow corridors created natural blind spots. The internal labyrinth made tracking difficult. Some interior windows allowed observation without being seen. The architecture seemed designed for discreet surveillance or lockdown. One night, Clara and Miguel were examining an old blueprint when they noticed a structural discrepancy in the west wing. There was a void in the drawing, enough space for an entire room, but with no recorded entrance. Miguel frowned. "This is not a measurement error. It's deliberate concealment." When Clara brought the discovery to Richard, he reacted with unusual coldness. "Certain areas are not stable. It's not worth the risk." But the argument was not convincing. Miguel had confirmed that the structure was solid. That same night, Clara received an anonymous envelope left under the hotel door. Inside, there was only an old photograph of the mansion still under construction. On one of the upper floors, construction workers posed in front of a secluded door. On the back, a handwritten phrase, "She built it so that they would never find it." No signature, without explanation. Clara stared at the image for several minutes. If the house was a safe, then what was kept there was no superstition. It was something planned, and someone was still protecting this secret. The anonymous photograph altered the pace of the investigation. Clara returned to Winchester Mystery House with a new attitude, no longer as a restorer, but as someone being deliberately observed. If anyone knew what she was looking for or what she might find, then the game had already begun. She decided to act before she was denied access. With Miguel, he organized a nighttime structural scan of the West Wing using density sensors and a handheld cavity scanner. Officially, it was just a stability test. Unofficially, they were looking for the void indicated in the old blueprint. The equipment confirmed there was a hidden space between two load-bearing walls. "It's not small," Miguel murmured. "It's at least 4 meters long." While they were analyzing the data, the hallway lights flickered. Electrical failures were not uncommon in buildings of that period, but the auxiliary generator should have kicked in immediately. This time, it took almost 30 seconds of absolute darkness. When the power came back on, the scanner was off. The internal memory was erased. Miguel turned pale. This doesn't happen on its own. The following morning, Clara was summoned to Richard Hale's office. He was too calm. "I've received complaints about procedures that deviate from protocol," he said, sliding a report across the table. "Unauthorized equipment, restricted areas." Clara kept her voice steady. "There's a hidden room in the West Wing. It's in the original structure." Richard observed her for a long time before replying, "Not everything that has been built should be reopened." It wasn't denial. It was a warning. Hours later, Clara discovered that her digital access to the archived blueprints had been revoked. The server indicated administrative update. Miguel also had his credentials restricted. The pressure was mounting. Determined, Clara decided to explore on her own after the tours ended. She carried only a flashlight and the old photograph. Using approximate measurements from the historical plan, she counted steps between structural beams, measured distances from exterior windows, and discreetly marked the wood with a pencil. The house seemed to react to his presence. Creaking noises followed her movements. Doors she remembered being closed were ajar. The air felt colder in the West Wing, not like a supernatural breeze, but like redirected internal circulation. Functional architecture. Thoughtful architecture. As he pressed against the wall indicated by the scanner, he felt a slight hollow vibration under his knuckles. Unlike the rest of the structure, she found a slightly misaligned frame, an almost invisible detail. When lateral pressure was applied, part of the panel slid a few centimeters. It wasn't just a false wall, it was a mechanism. Before it could fully open, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Clara turned off the flashlight. Richard's silhouette appeared around the bend in the hallway, illuminated only by the distant light from the stairs. He didn't seem surprised. "Are you looking for something specific?" he asked in a low voice. Clara decided not to back down. "There's a hidden camera here. Who else knows about it?" The silence that followed was not one of confusion, but of calculation. "You're seeing ghosts where there's only old wood." But he took a step forward, and he placed his hand exactly over the point where the panel was moving. That was confirmation enough. Clara took a step back, maintaining control. "This isn't about legends, it's about deliberate concealment." Richard looked at her with something new in his gaze. Not anger, but urgency. Some truths, when exposed, do not liberate anyone. Before Clara could answer, a loud bang echoed through the upper floor. A heavy, metallic sound. Miguel appeared running down the opposite hallway. "You guys need to see this." Upstairs, part of the floor had given way, revealing a narrow compartment between the beams. Inside, there was a small, rusty iron chest. It didn't look old enough to be from the original building. Someone had put it there later, and someone had tried to hide it again. When Miguel tried to pull it out, he realized it was stuck inside, as if something was blocking it from the other side. Clara felt the weight of the moment. The house didn't just hide the past. It concealed recent interventions. Richard watched from a distance, motionless. Even if he knew about the chest, he didn't expect it to be found in that way. The tension was no longer theoretical. There was physical evidence that someone had been tampering with the structure. And the emptiness in the West Wing was probably greater than they had imagined. The question ceased to be what Sarah Winchester hid. It became, what was Richard still protecting? The chest found between the beams could not be removed that night. The compromised structure required immediate containment, and Miguel cordoned off the area with safety tape. Officially, it was a structural incident. Unofficially, it was proof that someone had been using the Winchester Mystery House as a contemporary hideout. Clara realized that the conflict was not merely historical, it was current. Determined to understand what might have happened in the 1980s, Clara located old files at the local San Jose newspaper. The name mentioned by Hannah, Daniel Mercer, appeared only in a brief note. Employee leaves position after internal incident. No police report, no formal investigation. Clara found Mercer's old address. The house was empty, but an elderly neighbor remembered fragments of it. He used to say that the house had floors that breathed, that there were corridors that didn't appear on guided tours. Days later, Clara received an anonymous email with a scanned attachment, a diary page attributed to Mercer. The handwriting was shaky. "They don't build anymore. They seal it off." The phrase echoed like a direct repeat of the note Clara had received earlier. Someone was connecting the pieces for her. But who? Meanwhile, Miguel began to act more cautiously. He had discovered that recently installed motion sensors were configured not to register activity at certain times in the early morning. Manual configuration. It wasn't a technical error. By discreetly confronting a security technician, I learned that the order had come directly from Richard Hale. Miguel began to question whether his continued involvement in the project jeopardized his professional license. Even so, he continued to help Clara, not out of supernatural curiosity, but out of ethical unease. "If there's a hidden camera, there might be something illegal going on there," he said. "And what if they knew about it before we did?" Time pressure was starting to mount. The official restoration would enter the public phase in less than 3 weeks. After that, external audits would take place, and any unregistered intervention could be discovered, or completely concealed. Anna revealed something she had kept to herself for years. On certain nights, when the tours ended, she had heard footsteps in closed wings. Not shuffling. Firm. Human. Once, he had followed the sound to the west wing. You will find Richard Alley, alone. No flashlight, as if he knew exactly where to go in the maze. "He never seems lost," Hannah said. "Not even in the parts that don't appear on public maps." This observation changed Clara's perspective. While architecture was an enigma for visitors and researchers, for Richard it was familiar territory. The trunk was finally removed 2 days later, under formal supervision. But when they opened it, they found only seemingly irrelevant old documents, receipts, incomplete blueprints, generic correspondence from the early 20th century. Too disappointing. Too much staging. Clara realized that it was a distraction, something placed there to be found. While reviewing the scanned copies of the documents, he noticed that one of them had recent fold marks, as if it had been handled not long ago. On the back, almost invisible under direct light, were numerical coordinates. They weren't dates. They were measurements, height, depth, distance between beams, corresponding to the empty space in the west wing. The trunk wasn't the secret. It was the map. Clara faced a growing dilemma. Reporting suspicions without concrete evidence could ruin her career. Richard had considerable political and financial influence in the city. At the same time, with each passing day, the chance increased that the area would be permanently sealed off under the pretext of structural instability. The house seemed to conspire with time. Doors that once opened easily now jammed. Minor repairs were being made without Miguel being informed. External teams would show up for emergency maintenance. No, the tension was no longer just investigative. It became a race against oblivion. There were 19 days left until the official reopening of the mansion with the newly restored wing. If there were a significant hidden chamber, it would need to be accessed before that. Clara decided she would not wait for formal authorization. Using the measurements coded in the document inside the trunk, he marked exactly where the wall should collapse. She didn't know what she would find. But I was certain of one thing. The mansion was no longer being built to confuse spirits. It was being used to protect something living, and with each step he took, he drew closer to a truth that someone was still willing to hide. 17 days before the official reopening of the Winchester Mystery House, Clara decided to cross the line she had respected until then. Without informing Miguel or Hannah, he returned to the West Wing after closing time, taking only a compact lever, a flashlight, and the document with the hidden measurements found in the trunk. The house was too quiet, not with the touristy silence of the end of the workday, but with the heavy stillness of a prepared space. Clara measured the distance between the beams again. 4 steps from the interior window with floral-stained glass. 2 from the sculpted column. Exact height marked on the paper. He pressed the indicated spot. Nothing. He applied lateral force with the lever, exploiting the seemingly fixed frame. A dry, crackling sound echoed. Part of the wall slid inward, revealing a narrow corridor, lined not with Victorian wood, but with reinforced concrete, a material added much later than the original construction of the house. That was not a legacy of the 19th century. It was a modern adaptation. Clara went inside. The hallway had discreet recessed lighting, recent electrical wiring, and small cameras positioned in the corners. They weren't old. They were functional. The space led to a simple, unadorned metal door. Before he could touch her, he heard the voice behind him. "You shouldn't have done that." Richard Hale was in the hallway, blocking the exit. There was no more theatre. "That's not part of the house's history," Clara said, pointing to the concrete. "That's yours." Richard did not deny it. His expression wasn't one of fury, but of someone finally tired of maintaining a parallel narrative. "The house has always been used for hiding," he replied. "I simply continued what already existed." Clara opened the metal door. What he found was neither gold, nor macabre relics, nor human remains. It was a filing room, modern archives, shelves organized with folders, hard drives, financial documents, contracts, and records of the purchase of historic properties throughout the country. And something even more disturbing, modified architectural plans of various historic buildings in the United States. Clara recognized names: mansions on the East Coast, ancient theaters in the Midwest, abandoned fortifications in the South, all acquired by companies associated with Richard. "You're replicating the model," she murmured. Richard took a step forward. "Historic places are perfect, complex structures, distracted tourists, spaces that no one questions when they are closed for restoration." He touched one of the folders. Secure storage, discreet transfers, private meetings. It wasn't superstition, it was logistics. The mansion had been converted into the hub of a clandestine network that used historic properties as storage and circulation points for untraceable assets. The architectural labyrinth offered perfect cover. The myth protected reality. Clara felt the weight of the revelation. "The trunk was a distraction," she said. "It was a test," Richard corrected. "I needed to see how far you would go." The turning point wasn't the existence of the room. It was the fact that Clara was now inside her. Richard slowly closed the door behind him. "You're too smart to believe in ghosts." His voice was low and firm, and smart enough to understand that certain structures can support more than just wood. Clara quickly assessed the space. There were no windows. Only one way out, the narrow corridor through which she had entered. "Are you going to stop me from leaving?" Richard hesitated. That second of hesitation revealed more than any confession. He was not an impulsive killer. He was a strategist. "You have a promising career," he said. "I can double your contract, triple it. You catalogue what I allow. The rest remains closed." Clara looked around. That room dismantled the entire public narrative surrounding the mansion. It wasn't just a matter of financial corruption. It was a deliberate manipulation of historical heritage as a facade. She then realized something even more unsettling. On one of the shelves, there was a file with his name on it. Open. Photos of her arriving at the hotel, talking to Miguel, visiting the municipal archives. The game had begun even before she accepted the project. The revelation wasn't just about what was hidden. It was about the fact that she had been chosen. "Why me?" he asked. Richard replied without looking away, "Because you don't believe in ghosts. People who believe in legends never look for real proof." The ground seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The story wasn't about the past. It was about the present. And Clara had just crossed a line from which there was no neutral return. Outside the room, the house creaked softly, as if each wall held echoes of decisions made within. The mansion was not an old vault. It was an active system. And now Clara was part of it, as a threat or as an ally. The choice she made in the next few hours would change not only her life, but the fate of that entire historical structure. The silence inside the concrete chamber seemed denser than the air in the labyrinthine corridors of the Winchester mystery house. Clara kept her gaze steady, but her mind worked at a calculated pace. Richard hadn't slammed the door shut on impulse. He had closed it to negotiate. "You can't just keep me here," Clara said, controlling her tone. "There are records of my presence." "Controllable records," Richard replied. "Security systems, internal reports, public narratives. It all depends on who writes the final report." It wasn't an explicit threat. It was a demonstration of reach. Clara understood at that moment that Richard's power lay not in violence, but in influence. He manipulated narratives, not people directly. He transformed facts into administrative misunderstandings. She needed to leave there with something more than just words. While Richard was speaking, Clara discreetly slipped her cell phone out of her pocket and activated the audio recording. She couldn't rely solely on that, but it was a start. "You're using historical heritage as a front for clandestine operations," she said, steering the conversation. "Transfer of assets, private meetings. This goes beyond tax irregularities." Richard did not deny it. "The real world operates in grey areas, Clara. These places offer discretion. Nothing more." But there was tension in his posture. He hadn't expected her to be so direct. Outside, Miguel was beginning to notice something was wrong. The internal system showed an area of the West Wing temporarily offline, exactly where Clara had been working for the past few nights. He was familiar with the maintenance procedures. That wasn't maintenance. Without alerting the administration, he went to the West Wing with inspection tools. As he approached the marked wall, he noticed recent microcracks in the frame, signs that the mechanism had been activated. Miguel wasn't impulsive, but he also didn't ignore technical standards. He began to carefully remove the outer panel. Inside the chamber, Clara quickly analyzed the files on the shelves. She discreetly photographed some pages, records of overnight transfers, property codes in other states, schedules aligned with structural reforms. It wasn't conclusive proof yet, but it was a strong indication. Richard noticed the movement. "Don't turn this into a war you can't sustain." "You already did," she replied. He moved closer, decreasing the physical distance between the two. "If you expose this, it won't just be the mansion that suffers. Employees will lose their jobs. The city will lose investments. You will be seen as the one responsible." There, the real weapon lay: public guilt. Clara felt the impact of the strategy. The narrative could easily be reversed. Historian exaggerates suspicions, causes scandal, harms local heritage. But before she could answer, a metallic clang echoed down the hallway. The outer panel was being forced. Richard turned around instinctively. Miguel appeared at the partially disassembled opening, flashlight in hand. He stopped when he saw the concrete corridor. "So it wasn't a legend after all," he murmured. The balance of power shifted at that moment. Richard assessed the situation quickly. Two technical professionals inside a clandestine chamber posed a different risk than a single investigator. "You're misinterpreting this," he tried, resuming his calculated posture. Miguel ignored the explanation and went inside. "Sensors disabled, records manipulated. This is not interpretation." The tension was now threefold. Clara realized that the conflict had gone beyond the individual realm. Miguel was a witness. The structure of the secret was beginning to crack. Richard didn't react violently. Instead, he did something unexpected. He picked up the phone and called someone. "Move the meeting forward. We have an internal leak," he said, ending the call immediately afterward. That sentence chilled the atmosphere. Internal leak. It wasn't just about the mansion. It was about a larger network. Miguel exchanged a quick glance with Clara. The revelation increased the risk. "This doesn't end here," Richard said, already heading towards the hallway. He didn't try to stop them from leaving, because he knew that the conflict would now become strategic. In the following hours, the atmosphere around the mansion changed noticeably. External technicians arrived before dawn. Parts of the West Wing were temporarily closed off for structural safety reasons. Clara and Miguel received formal notifications of temporary suspension pending administrative review. Hannah, upon learning of the suspension, understood without much explanation being needed. "You found it," he simply said. Clara was now facing real consequences. His credibility could be attacked. Access to the exams could be blocked. The public narrative could be shaped against her. But there was something Richard hadn't foreseen. She was not alone. Miguel was a forensic witness. And there were digital records already sent to external storage. Clara had done this before entering the chamber, as an unconscious precaution. The mansion, once the scene of an investigation, had become an institutional battleground. The biggest consequence wasn't the discovery of the room. It was the beginning of an open confrontation between historical truth and contemporary power. And now, time was running faster than ever. The official suspension was published 3 days later. The internal memo claimed technical procedures carried out outside the scope of the contract. Nothing about hidden cameras, nothing about clandestine files. The narrative was beginning to take shape. Clara spent the first few hours after being removed from her position, feeling the weight of Richard's maneuver. He didn't need to discredit her publicly yet. Isolating her was enough. Without access to the Winchester mystery house, she would lose the central element of the investigation. But it was precisely at that moment that his stance changed. Until then, Clara had acted as a researcher, analyzing, cataloging, and cross-referencing data. Now he needed to act as a strategist. She organized all the evidence into 3 categories: photographs from the camera and files, manipulated sensor logs provided by Miguel, digital copies of modified blueprints from other properties, historical. Instead of sending everything to the authorities immediately, which could allow for political interference, he decided to break up the information. He distributed encrypted copies to 3 different contacts: a university professor specializing in historical preservation, an investigative journalist from Sacramento, and a lawyer specializing in cultural heritage. If something happened to her or to Miguel, the files would be released automatically. It wasn't paranoia. It was an adaptation. Miguel also changed. Previously cautious and focused only on technical standards, he began reviewing structural designs of other properties associated with Richard. He found similar patterns, internal reinforcements that were not recorded in public records, nighttime maintenance contracts, and gaps in audits. He is no longer just a witness. He became an active network analyst. "It's not improvisation," he told Clara. "It's a replicated method." The most visible transformation, however, was emotional. Clara realized that her motivation was no longer just to protect the historical integrity of the mansion. It was to prevent the cultural heritage from being used as a shield for clandestine operations. She returned to the mansion's grounds during visiting hours, like any other tourist. She watched the groups enter, listening to stories about the eccentric heiress and the restless spirits. The myth still worked perfectly. And there lay the brutal irony. The supernatural narrative protected an absolutely real system. Clara understood something essential at that moment. Richard did not create the myth, he had used it. 3 days later, the journalist responded to the contact. I had received previous complaints involving historic properties acquired by companies linked to Richard, but never any concrete evidence. Now there was evidence. However, publishing without robust verification could result in a defamation lawsuit. Clara needed something undeniable, something physical, something that would connect the mansion's security camera to external financial transactions. She decided to return, not as an employee, but as a regular visitor during the night tour. On the night of the tour, Clara walked through the winding corridors of the historic staged San Jose. She discreetly observed the access points to the West Wing. She noticed that 2 new security guards were strategically positioned near the restricted area. Richard was tightening control. But reinforcement also means fear of exposure. Clara noticed something that had previously gone unnoticed. A service door near the external emergency exit had a newly replaced lock. It was different from the old lock on the house. She didn't force anything that night. Her evolution was no longer impulsive. He was patient. Clara began to act on multiple fronts. Formal request for an independent structural audit, public request for clarification regarding restricted areas, contact with national conservation organizations, historic. She stopped operating in the shadows. It began operating within the institutional framework. Richard responded with invitations for private negotiation. She refused them all. The former, Clara would have hesitated, worried about her reputation and professional stability. The new Clara understood that neutrality only benefited those who controlled the narrative. Her growth wasn't due to fiery speeches. It was related to a change in behavior. Previously, he reacted to Richard's actions. Now, he was forcing him to react. Miguel informed that a large equipment transfer would take place at the mansion 2 days before the official reopening. Trucks would arrive in the early morning hours under the justification of installing stage lighting. The window was closing. If anything was to be removed from the chamber, it would happen that night. Clara took a deep breath. She was no longer just a historian investigating an architectural mystery. It had become a central piece in a confrontation between truth and manipulation. And for the first time since crossing the mansion gate, she felt no fear. He felt clarity. The next move would define everything. There were 4 days left until the official reopening of the Winchester Mystery House. The marketing campaign in San Jose was already underway. Banners, digital ads, invitations for investors and local authorities. The public narrative spoke of historical revitalization and a renewed immersive experience. But behind the scenes, things were happening differently. Miguel confirmed 2 trucks would arrive at 2:17 a.m. on Friday morning. Internal records classified the items as stage lighting equipment and temporary structural reinforcement. Clara knew it was the final window. If files were removed from the concrete chamber, evidence would disappear before any external audit could take place. The Sacramento journalist reported that she was ready to publish a preliminary story, not accusatory, but questioning inconsistencies in the structural renovations of the mansion and other properties linked to Richard Hale. This would create public pressure. Hannah, who had been discreet until then, made an unexpected decision. She provided a recorded statement affirming that certain wings were being accessed outside of visiting hours by people not registered in the visitor system. She didn't mention the camera directly, but she confirmed suspicious patterns. Even Daniel Mercer's old diary proved useful. Clara handed over certified copies to the historical preservation attorney, linking the ceiling pattern to the past and the present. The pieces were in position. Now all that was missing was the physical confrontation. At 1:52 a.m., Clara and Miguel discreetly parked a few blocks from the mansion. They weren't there for a dramatic break-in, but to document the event. Miguel had managed to maintain remote access to the secondary electrical system. something Richard had overlooked during the sensor reconfiguration. When the trucks arrived at 2:18 a.m., Clara began continuous recording. License plates, times, number of people unloading equipment. What caught our attention was not the volume of boxes, it was the direction. Instead of heading to the central stage where the set design was supposedly going to be installed, the workers went directly to the closed-off West Wing, visual confirmation. Miguel carried out the next step. He discreetly triggered a temporary reset of the wing's lighting system, forcing the activation of the hidden corridor's interior lights for a few seconds, enough to capture an image of the metal door being opened and boxes being removed. Clara felt her pulse quicken. There lay the physical link between the public narrative and the clandestine operation. But Richard showed up. He walked with calculated calm, monitoring the movement. He stopped for a moment and looked directly in the direction where Clara was positioned, even from a distance. It was impossible for me to see her clearly, but he seemed to know. Suddenly, the exterior lights of the parking lot flickered. Miguel looked at the tablet. They detected the reboot. The trucks sped up the pace of loading. Men began quickly closing the doors of the West Wing. Richard picked up the phone. Clara received a notification on her cell phone seconds later. An official email announcing that the reopening of the mansion would be brought forward to 2 days later, due to the early completion of the works. Strategic movement. He was rushing to legalize the space before any complaints gained traction. While trying to transmit the images to the secure server, Clara noticed signal interference. The upload kept freezing. Miguel analyzed it quickly. Local network blocking. Richard wasn't just removing evidence. I was trying to prevent leaks in real time. Clara made an immediate decision. She sent the material directly to the journalist using an alternative mobile network, even though it was incomplete. It was risky, but enough to start public questioning before the official ceremony. The boxes continued to be loaded. If the contents were to leave the mansion, the chamber could be emptied before any inspection. Clara knew that the next step would require her physical presence on the property. It wasn't enough to register from the outside. She needed to confront the removal while it was still happening. Miguel took a deep breath. If we go in now, there will be no administrative reversal. Clara gazed at the irregular silhouette of the mansion under the dim light of dawn. The winding architecture, created decades ago, now served as the backdrop for a contemporary conflict. "There's no going back now," he replied. They crossed the street. Tensions had reached a breaking point. The climax was just hours away. Dawn enveloped the Winchester mystery house like a heavy cloak when Clara and Miguel crossed the side service gate. They didn't run. They walked with confidence, like people who belonged there. 2 security guards were positioned near the West Wing. Miguel approached first. "A structural failure has been detected in the closed-off wing," he said with technical certainty. "If they are removing internal weight without recalculating the load, they could compromise the main beams." The language worked. One of the security guards hesitated. The structure was a serious legal responsibility. While he tried to confirm over the radio, Clara moved forward down the partially open corridor. The hidden panel had already been completely removed. The wide-open metal door revealed the chamber being hastily emptied, metal boxes lined up on the floor, folders scattered across an improvised table. Richard was in the center of the room, coordinating the operation. He looked up when Clara entered. There were no surprises. There was recognition. "You chose direct confrontation," he said, too calmly for the situation. "You chose to use historical landmarks as a facade," Clara replied, walking to the center of the room. Miguel entered right behind them, positioning himself near the door, momentarily blocking the workers' exit. The tension inside wasn't chaotic, it was electric. Clara approached the still-open boxes. In one of them, she saw something different from the familiar financial files. Encrypted storage devices, identified with property codes, scattered throughout the country. "This isn't just asset movement," she said. "It's central coordination." Richard maintained control of the tone. "You think too small. That's influence infrastructure." He pointed to the modified plants on the walls. "These places connect people who can't meet in daylight. The mansion is just one node in the network." The word echoed. Network. The secret wasn't just financial. He was a politician, business, strategic. Clara then realized the true extent of what she was facing. It wasn't a man manipulating a historic house. It was a system using symbols from the past to operate in the present. The former Clara would have tried to convince, argue, persuade. The new Clara has taken action. She walked over to the chamber's internal electrical panel, which Miguel had already identified, and manually flipped the main switch. The entire west wing was plunged into darkness, but it wasn't an impulsive act. Miguel, prepared, immediately connected the external secondary system, the one Richard had ignored, redirecting power to the building's main lights. The towers of the mansion lit up abruptly, full lighting, the facade gleaming in the early morning, external cameras activated in emergency mode. At the same time, the journalist published the preliminary story online, including images captured of the trucks and the nighttime activity. Notifications started vibrating on workers' cell phones. Richard realized what had happened in seconds. "You've turned this into a spectacle," he said, his composure finally giving way. "No," Clara replied. "I made it a public record." A distant siren echoed down the street. No police yet, but journalists and curious onlookers were starting to arrive. The anticipated reopening and the online news had generated immediate alarm. Richard assessed the situation with cold swiftness. If I confronted them there, I would confirm everything. If he backed down, he would lose control of the narrative. He chose the third option. He walked over to one of the boxes, took out a storage device, and lifted it slightly. "That doesn't depend on this house," he said. "You raised a point. Not the entire network." That was the final twist. Clara realized that although she had prevented the silent removal, she had not completely dismantled the system. She had only illuminated part of it, but it was enough. Local authorities, alerted by the public commotion and the presence of the press, entered the property minutes later. The external presence prevented any immediate destruction of evidence. Miguel submitted technical records. Clara presented the photos and documents. Richard couldn't resist. He didn't run away either. Clara's final transformation occurred in that instant. She understood that victory did not mean the complete destruction of the adversary, but the breaking of the silence that sustained him. The mansion, which for decades had been a symbol of supernatural mystery, was becoming the stage for a concrete revelation. Restless spirits never existed, but the hidden system, yes, and now it was in plain sight. The following morning dawned differently over the Winchester Mystery House. There were no lines of tourists eager for ghost stories. There were press vans, municipal officials, and historical preservation experts coming and going with briefcases, cameras, and tense expressions. The official reopening has been cancelled. Instead, a formal investigation was launched involving the misuse of cultural heritage, financial irregularities, and possible federal violations related to properties linked to Richard Hale's companies. He wasn't handcuffed in front of the cameras. He was taken in for questioning. The difference was subtle but significant. The system he had helped to sustain still had tentacles. However, the silence had been broken, and that altered the balance. Clara went from being a suspended employee to a central figure in the investigation. Her decision to act strategically, distributing evidence before the confrontation, ensured that the narrative could not be turned against her. National historical preservation organizations expressed public support, reinforcing the need for independent audits of privately owned heritage sites open to tourism. Miguel's role was also recognized. His technical reports demonstrated that the structural interventions were planned for concealment, not restoration. He went from being just a contracted engineer to becoming a consultant in property security audits. Hannah, for her part, saw the guided tours temporarily suspended, but instead of losing ground, she participated in the complete redesign of the mansion's historical tour. The narrative has changed. Less legend, more real-world context. In San Jose, the reaction was intense. Some of the population feared losses in tourism. Others demanded transparency. What emerged was something unexpected, a greater appreciation of heritage as a public responsibility, even when it is privately owned. The mansion ceased to be merely an exotic attraction and began to be studied as an example of how myths can obscure contemporary practices. The concrete chamber was officially documented and sealed, this time under state supervision. The seized contents became part of a broader investigation involving other historic properties across the country. The entire network wasn't discovered all at once, but connections began to emerge. The fall was not instantaneous. It was progressive. Clara returned to the mansion weeks later, now as an independent consultant. She walked through the winding corridors with a different perspective. Previously, via enigmatic architecture. Now through layers of human use, grief, obsession, manipulation, and resistance. She did not feel exuberant triumph. I felt clarity. She understood that the real danger had never been the eccentric past of the house's heiress, but the contemporary capacity to instrumentalize historical symbols for invisible purposes. Upon touching one of the restored walls of the West Wing, he realized something simple yet powerful. The house had always been a reflection of whoever controlled it. And for the first time in decades, it wasn't in the hands of someone interested in hiding it. The federal investigation expanded to other properties associated with the network. Some revealed similar structures, discrete cameras, duplicate records, areas without official monitoring. Not all those responsible were exposed immediately, but the pattern was identified, and that was enough to dismantle the invisibility mechanism that sustained the system. The mansion remained open to the public for months afterward, but under new management and strict oversight. Visitors still heard stories of corridors that led nowhere. The difference was that now they knew some secrets are architectural, others are human, and humans can be held responsible. Months later at dusk, Clara returned to the Winchester mystery house without cameras, without investigators, without tension. The house seemed smaller, or perhaps she was bigger on the inside. The towers still cast irregular shadows over San Jose, and visitors still whispered about restless spirits. But now there were explanatory plaques detailing the historical layers, including the recent period of investigation. As Clara passed through the West Wing, she paused for a moment. The wall was officially sealed, not as a secret, but for the record. She didn't believe in ghosts. Still, I knew that some structures hold echoes, not of the dead, but of choices. And that house would never be used in silence again. Stories like that of the Winchester Mystery House remind us that not every mystery involves ghosts. Sometimes it involves silence, power, and human decisions hidden behind convenient narratives. Do you believe that historical sites can be used for something beyond what we see? Have you ever visited a place that seemed to hold more than the official history tells us? Share your opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your reflection can open up new discussions about memory, truth, and responsibility. If this story caught your attention, stay tuned for more tales where the past and present intersect in unexpected ways.